Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Helen, for inviting me to give a talk at your summer school. I really appreciate the invitation. Whenever I attended your summer school in 2016, there must have been, only 15 or so of us, so it's incredible to see that 4 years later, the number of students you have engaged with your classics summer program. So in this talk, we will be exploring divination generally, and then we will have a look at divination at classical Sparta itself. So Sparta is without any doubt a much explored topic, but also a topic where much of the focus has been disproportionately and sometimes mistakenly placed on themes like ultramasculine militarism. So for example, Frank Miller's 300, which featured Spartan warriors so masculine that they didn't even require armor in battle. Another focus of Spartan studies shared by both ancient and modern authors is on famous Spartan leaders, the kings and generals like brave Leonidas at Thermopylae, or the daring Lysander at Aegos of Sparta, or the pious Agesilaus who reigned for a long 38 years. However, behind these significant leaders are characters who held immense influence in their world, characters who ancient authors recognized often in high acclaim, but are nonetheless sidelined by many modern historians and the popular narrative. This influential type of character is what the Greeks call the Mantis. So the Mantis has been translated from a soothsayer or a prophet, but today will be translated as a seer. So what was a Mantis? Well, a Mantis was a religious specialist, predominantly male, although there is evidence of female Mantis, and the Mantis usually worked in a freelance capacity. They held expertise in many religious fields. For example, you would hire a Mantis if you needed to purify a polluted household, or if you suffered from a mental or physical illness, a seer was able to heal you through the use of drugs or incarnations. However, the real specialism of a Mantis lay in what the Greeks called mantiki techni, the craft of divination. Divination was a means of communicating with the gods with the goal of clarifying the circumstances to allow decision-making. As the Stoic philosopher Chrysippus wrote, divination is the power to see, understand, and explain premonitory signs given to men by the gods. Its duty is to know in advance the disposition of the gods towards men, the manner in which that disposition is shown, and by what means the gods may be propitiated and their threatened ills averted. Xenophon, our late 5th century, early 4th century historian, also shares a similar sentiment. He says that the eternal gods know all things, both what has been, what is, what shall come to pass as a result of each present or past event. And if men consult the gods, they reveal to those whom they are propitious, and what they ought to do and what they ought not to do. So really it was in your interest to be engaged with divination. Sacrifice well, and the all-knowing gods could help guide you to make the correct decision through any of life's uncertainties. It is important to emphasize that the Mantis was not like a priest. The priests were mostly public officials located at sanctuaries or temples, and they often had little to zero religious training because they were mostly elected to the priesthood for set terms. Furthermore, apart from a few exceptions, i.e. the Pythia at Delphi or the oracles at Dodona, these seers were primarily freelance workers who traveled from city to city and through the countryside seeking any form of employment. Nor was the Mantis like the Kresmologoi, the oracle collectors who Aristophanes is so hostile towards, as can be seen in his depiction of them in Birds, where he portrays them as gluttons, generally held in very high esteem. And if they were particularly skilled or famous, then the seer might attach himself to a general or a statesman. In fact, a seer named Silenos from Ambracia was fortunate enough to find himself in the employment of the Prince of Persia, Cyrus the Younger, whenever Cyrus was trying to win for himself the Persian throne. Xenophon, in his Anabasis, provides an insight into some of Silenos's financial achievements. He writes, "Then Cyrus summoned Silenos, the Ambraciot seer, and gave him 3,000 darics. For on the 11th day before this, while sacrificing, he had told Cyrus that the king would not fight within 10 days. And Cyrus had said, then he will not fight at all, if he will not fight within 10 days. However, if your prediction proves true, I promise you 10 talents. So it was this money that he then paid over, the 10 days having passed. 10 talents was an incredible sum of money. For some context, during the Peloponnesian War, an Athenian trireme crew of 200 rowers was paid one single talent for a month's worth of work. So in one single act of divination, Silenus had made a fortune. Of course, this degree of payment was rare, and far more than the typical Mantis could ever hope to achieve. But some sources do indicate that they made a fairly decent living. In classical Byzantium, for example, seers were taxed a third of their profits in order to conduct their practice in the city. So they must have been making a relatively high wage for the polis to impose such a taxation. Even in Sophocles' Antigone, Creon, the ruler of Thebes, gets into a dispute with the legendary Mantis Tiresias, and he accuses him and the Mantic tribe of being silver-loving and of taking advantage of his wealth. This is probably a reflection of negative opinions shared on seers, but nonetheless, these examples display that for some at least, there was no price too high for accurate communication with the gods. But how did the seer go about their job, and how were they able to identify these omens? Well, there were many ways in which the gods might communicate with the Mantis. In Aeschylus's Prometheus Bound, the Titan Prometheus lists the various methods of divine communication. I'm going to read out a passage from this. Prometheus says, I devised the many methods of prophecy, and I first judged what truth there is in dreams, and I first made known to the mortals the meanings of chance utterances hard to interpret, and of the omens one encounters while on the road, and I defined the flight of crook-clawed birds. I explained which of them were auspicious or inauspicious by nature, and what their ways of life were, and what their dislikes and likes of one another and their alliances. And I also taught mortals about the smoothness of entrails, and what colour the gall ought to have in order to please the gods, and all about the dappled beauty of the lobe of the liver. It was I who burned thigh bones wrapped in fat and the long shank bone, thus leading mortals down the path of his darkly signifying art, and it was I who opened their eyes to the signs that are fiery and yet dim to understanding. So from Aeschylus's passage, we can identify some modes of divination that our seer would have practiced. Ornithomancy, the reading of omens from the actions of birds. Orniromancy, the interpretations of dreams. Empyromancy, divination from fire and smoke. And finally, and most importantly, extispicy, identifying omens from animal entrails, but primarily of the liver. So it was responsibility of the Mantis, therefore, to be proficient in all forms of divination, so that they could, on request, procure omens, interpret them, and deliver to their employer any messages sent from the gods. Although the seer would have been skilled in these various forms of divination, the examination of the entrails, especially the liver, appears to have been the preferred and most common divinatory method. Whenever the Mantis had opened up the sacrificial victim, he would inspect the liver, which would reveal whether or not the signs were favourable. The outcome was always a yes or no answer. The gods show favour, or the gods do not show favour. If the liver lacked a lobe, it was considered a terrible omen. There are many literary sources, as well as pottery artwork, that highlight the significance placed upon extispicy. If we look here at these three pictures of vase paintings dating from 525 to 450 BC, there's a recurring scene of a young boy presenting a liver to a soldier for inspection, and an old bearded man standing behind the young boy. In these scenes, it is likely that the soldier is not the Mantis. Rather, he is a soldier just simply departing for war and trying to ascertain if the gods are showing favour. Due to the writings of Xenophon, we know that most soldiers would have had a basic level of understanding as to what signs they should be looking for in the liver. Xenophon said that if a liver lacked a lobe, then it was a sign that even a layman could perceive. Ordinary soldiers would have acquired this basic understanding because divinatory sacrifice was a spectacle. It was done in front of an audience, or indeed in front of the army. Before every battle, the seer conducted a battlefield sacrifice called the Sphageia, and here the sacrifice would attempt to ascertain if the gods were on their sides and if they would help them secure victory. Here's a piece of pottery showing a mantis carrying out the sphageia on the battlefield. The seer here is young and only partially armoured, which might mean that they would have dressed in full armour after the sacrifices were made. And unlike what many would imagine, the majority of our seers fought in these battles. They were soldiers as well as religious specialists. See here a grave stele of an Athenian mantis called Cleobulus. The depiction of the eagle and the snake refers to Homer's Iliad, Book 12. And there is also an inscription on this monument which attests to the militaristic achievements of Cleobulus. Cleobulus of Archaic, Mantis, Cleobulus, son of Glaucus, the earth covers you who have died. You were both an excellent mantis and a superb spear fighter, whom the great-hearted people of Erectheus once crowned for being the best throughout Greece to garner kudos. But even the battlefield sacrifice, the seers were restricted to the type of questions they could ask the gods. They were forced to ask a question with a yes or no answer. Is it better to do X or to do Y? Or, in one case for Xenophon, should I be the leader of the army? But at the oracular temple of Zeus at Dodona, the oldest oracle in ancient Greece and second only to Delphian prestige, we have found 1400 lead oracular tablets, and they all follow that very formula. Here are some questions of which the visitors had asked of Zeus. Good luck, Parmenides asks Zeus, Naus, and Dione whether he will fare better if he stays at home. God, good luck, Archonidas asks the god whether I should sail into Sicily. Did Dorcelos steal the cloth? Or whether it will be useful for me if I worked as a bronzesmith. And finally, Denocles of Apollonia asks Zeus and Dione about offspring, whether by sacrificing and praying to which of the gods there should be children. So what is insightful about these oracular tablets found at Dodona is that it is a window into some of the concerns that many regular Greeks, your typical Greeks, would have shared. Xenophon and his types of questions are the exceptions. Not many asked the gods whether or not they should lead a mercenary army, whereas many people would have asked the gods for guidance on issues like career paths, as is the case with our bronzesmith, or the worry and the uncertainty in raising a family like Denocles. These are the types of clients and the types of questions that the majority of our seers would have been experienced or would have experienced when they traveled from town to town. Now that we have established the role of the mantis and what was expected of them, we will now assess divination at Sparta and look at a selection of seers who practiced their craft there. In doing so, we will be exploring some of the most famous characters in the ancient Greek world, but for one reason or another, have until very recently often been relegated to the sidelines. The literary evidence suggests that the Spartans were a very religious people who understood religion as being a matter of strict observation and obedience to the authority of the divine. However, this unusual aspect of Spartan religion was not due to a presence of religious practices isolated and unrelated to other Greeks. Rather, it was because of what the other Greeks perceived as an unusual emphasis that the Spartans placed upon certain religious elements. Divination appears to be no exception to this observation, because likewise, although divination was a religious practice utilized by the vast majority of Greeks, and probably every Greek city-state, the sources nonetheless indicate that divination held a particular significance at Sparta. Indeed, it was within a divinatory context that Herodotus claimed the Spartans put the consideration of the gods before the considerations of men, just as they were willing to oust their oligarchic allies in Athens on the instructions of the Apollo at Delphi. A possible explanation for the emphasis the Spartans placed on the adherence to divination may be explained in two primary foundational structures of Spartan society. First, the so-called Great Retra, the famous constitution of the Spartans provided to them by the legendary lawgiver Lycurgus. The earliest source to mention Lycurgus is Herodotus, who credits him with providing the Spartans with a set of laws that would structure their entire political and social organization. The key aspect in Herodotus' story is that these laws were provided to Lycurgus by the Pythia at Delphi, and therefore by extension Apollo. And these laws were divinely ordained to be implemented at Sparta. So the significance of the Lycurgan myth is that it established and embedded the notion that Spartan socio-political structures were inseparable from its divinatory foundation. This is further supported by a passage in Xenophon, which states that Lycurgus had made it not only unlawful, but also unholy not to obey the laws that were ordained by the Pythian god. The second foundational structure is the Spartan kingship. Herodotus informs us that the diarchy at Sparta held two priesthoods, those of Zeus Lacedaemon and Zeus Oreneus. And according to Aristotle, their primary responsibility was to maintain the relationship between the community and the gods. The most effective method in discharging this responsibility was divination. The divine heritage of the Spartan kings enabled them to communicate with the gods, and they acted as a bridge between the mortal and the divine. Likewise, the institution of the dual kingship itself also received approval from the Mantic Pythia. This close relationship with Delphic Apollo in particular is further highlighted by the existence in Sparta of the Pythioi, permanent royal officials whose duty was to consult the Delphic oracle on state affairs at the king's command. These officials were part of the royal entourage. They shared the king's tent when on campaign, they dined with the kings, and they were responsible for archiving all prophecies made by the Pythia so that the kings could consult them when desired. So when we see this emphasis on divination at Sparta, it is unsurprising that seers held such a prominent position there. I'm going to discuss three famous seers that were at Sparta. The first seer of our period of study was a man named Megistius of Acarnania. Megistius was the seer for the Greek army that faced the Persians of Thermopylae in 480, and he was of the prestigious Mantic dynasty, the Melampodidae, and he had claimed to be a direct descendant of the legendary Mantis Melampus. Herodotus tells us that at Thermopylae, the seer Megistius, examining the sacrifices, first told the Hellenes at Thermopylae that death was coming to them with the dawn. The Spartan king Leonidas then ordered the seer to leave with most of the army, but Megistius refused to go. Rather, he sent away his only son, who was also with the army. So it is fair for us to assume that his son was like an apprentice, learning the craft from his father and continuing that particular Mantic dynasty. Megistius died alongside the Greeks who remained at Thermopylae. In the immediate years after the battle, 3 commemorative pillars with inscriptions were placed at the battle site. The first was dedicated to the Peloponnesians who fought there. The second for the Spartans, and it read, "Foreigner, go tell the Spartans that we lie here obedient to their commands." But the third pillar was dedicated to Megistius, and it said, "This is a monument to the renowned Megistius, slain by the Medes who crossed the Spercheius River. The seer knew well his coming doom, but endured not to abandon the leaders of Sparta." So our seer was the only named person in any 3 of these pillars. So today we remember Leonidas at Thermopylae, but in classical Greece it appears that Megistius the Mantis was just as renowned as a Spartan king, indeed, if not more so. After Thermopylae, the Persian threat was greater than ever, and Sparta needed a new seer for their army. According to Herodotus, the Spartans had learned of a Delphic prophecy concerning a man named Tisamenos of Elis, of the Amidai Mantic dynasty. I have paraphrased here what Herodotus has said. Tisamenos was consulting the oracle in Delphi about having offspring. The Pythia answered that he would win 5 great contests. Having failed to understand the oracle, he turned his attention to gymnastic exercises, thinking that he was going to win gymnastic contests. The Lacedaemonians, however, learned that the oracle given to Tisamenos was not referring to gymnastic contests, but to contests of Ares. And by persuading him with pay, they were also offering to make Tisamenos the leader in their wars, together with those of the Heraclidae, who were their kings. This passage highlights the degree of seriousness with which the Spartans regarded the ability of seers in warfare, because typically it was the prerogative of the Spartan kings to lead the army. But if Herodotus is correct, then it appears that the Spartans permitted their seer with significant military authority when out in campaign. Yet there was a further, even more striking condition of Tisamenos' employment. The seer demanded that in order for him to become seer for the Spartans, they must make both Tisamenos and his brother Spartan citizens, as well as all of their descendants. This is the only case of Spartan citizenship being granted to outsiders in the classical period, so testimony to the prestige and the respect of the Mantis at Sparta. The Spartans did not regret meeting Tisamenos' demand, and his first test was a battle of paramount importance, the Battle of Plataea, 479. So it appears that Tisamenos did indeed exercise his employment conditions at this battle, as Herodotus shows that the seer influenced how the army was commanded. His sacrifices showed that the gods would favour the Greeks if they stayed on the defensive, but if they crossed the Aesopus River, the sacrifice boded evil. Furthermore, in a dramatic passage of the battle, at the beginning of the battle, we can observe the Spartan commander Pausanias delaying engagement with the Persians until the seer Tisamenos procured favourable omens. This account allows us to see how the generals and seers may have interacted on the battlefield. And although Plato was probably technically correct when he said that the general shall give the orders to the seer and not the seer to the general, I think that the reality might have been a bit more nuanced. It is very possible that the generals would not want to proceed with any tactic without divine favour. And to secure that, he needed to accept the authority of the seer. Nonetheless, much to the Spartan delight, the seer Tisamenos secured victory at Plataea, and he went on to fill the Delphic prophecy of winning 5 of Ares' contests: Plataea against the Persians, Tegea against the Tegeans and the Argives, Dipaea against the Arcadians, Ithome against the rebelling Helots, and then his final battle in 457 was at Tanagra against the Argives and the Athenians. But even more significant for Sparta was that Tisamenos had secured Spartan citizenship for his descendants, meaning that for at least the remainder of the 5th century, the Spartans were able to rely on the Mantic expertise of the Aemidai dynasty. Indeed, the next famous Aemid was called Aegos of Sparta, or Aegeus of Sparta, grandson of Tisamenos. Aegeus was seer for Sparta during the latter years of the Peloponnesian War, and the sources suggest that he achieved a high level of fame in the classical Greek world, but again, he is often forgotten about in the modern narrative of events. Take, for example, the Battle of Aegos Patami in 405 BC, where through brilliant ability, the Spartan admiral Lysander captured the Athenian fleet and effectively crushed any chances for Athenian success in the remainder of the war. That is what comes to our mind when we think of the battle. We think of Lysander and his victory and how he erected monuments of his image at Delphi to account for his fame and success. But the travel writer Pausanias accounts the battle differently. He has this to say. They say that Aegeus, while acting as seer to Lysander, captured the Athenian fleet at Aegos Patami except for 10 ships. So at least for Pausanias, it was Aegeus who deserved the most credit for the victory, and not the Admiral Lysander. And this is partially confirmed by the Navarch's monument that Lysander himself founded at Delphi. This monument depicted Lysander, Aegeus the seer, and a third person, Hermon, the helmsman of Lysander's flagship. Further attesting to the fame of the seer Aegeus is that there was a bronze statue of him in the Spartan marketplace. So it is likely that he was renowned throughout the Greek world, but at the very least, the Spartans held him in very high esteem because of his ability to procure favourable omens and secure a Spartan victory in the Peloponnesian War. Indeed, it would seem that the dynasty of the Aemidai at Sparta were respected there for many generations, because even over the following 500 years after the Battle of Aegos Patami, the writer Pausanias was able to identify what he called a tomb of the Mantis from Elis, the so-called Aemidai. So it is clear that the Mantis was a central character in the Greek world. At a basic level, they helped people make decisions and they helped ease common anxieties, family issues, career problems, or financial worries. But they also operated at the highest levels of societies. As advisors to statesmen, they could influence domestic and foreign policies, but they could also co-lead armies and actually influence the tactics and strategies that were implemented. They were certainly more than mere morale boosters that has sometimes been suggested. In this talk, I wanted to show that these seers were famous in the ancient Greek world, and in many of our sources, they feature as the primary actor alongside the statesmen and generals that we dedicate most of our attention to today. I believe that if we are to gain a fuller understanding of decision-making in the classical Greek world, then we must not sideline the Mantis nor divination. Thank you.